of the things that I've been doing, and the reason why I've been running the Bitcoin Sydney community, is that for anyone who's ever come to one of our meetups would never have ended up in a position like that guy was. And it's one of the most important reasons why we need to separate Bitcoin and crypto, because the conflation between the two things not only harms Bitcoin itself through it meaning that skeptics, of course, are very quick to attribute many of the negative things that are actually true of crypto onto Bitcoin, but it also harms many people who are essentially deceived by the dishonest narratives that revolve around crypto. I'm a libertarian-leaning person. This isn't a talk that's designed to tell people that these things should be banned or anything like that. I just feel, though, that people should go in with both eyes open and understand what these things really are, so that by the time if they ever come across your radar, you can decide whether or not ultimately you want to be a gambler or not. But of course, whenever I sort of make these kind of arguments to people, people are quick to say, but surely not all crypto, right? I mean, surely there are some, some good projects, this sort of thing. It couldn't be all of them, couldn't be all, 250, was it a million now? I've lost count. There are so many now crypto projects and blockchains and so forth that it's gone beyond all ability for people to even make any, rational count of. So anyway, but let's see whether it really is all crypto, or whether, because it's easy for me just to take the most egregious of the projects, the most silly sounding projects, and use that to form the basis of my argument. And that's too easy, and I'm not going to do that. So let's have a look, and let's start by going back to the birth of Bitcoin itself. Is that going to advance? There we go. All right, so what you see on the screen here, and many of you will recognize the image on the top there, or the image with all the letters in it. What we see there is what's called the Bitcoin Genesis block. It's the very, very first block of Bitcoin mined, and a block of transactions. And in those transactions, it was also possible to embed information. Underneath is a very early Satoshi Nakamoto quote from the earliest days of the message boards. Only a few days, in fact, as you can see there, February 11, 2009. It's really only a few days after that Genesis block was first mined. But what we see in that is right from the start, Bitcoin had a very clearly defined problem. It wasn't a solution like crypto tends to be, looking for a problem to solve. There was already a problem in the existing financial system for which Bitcoin provided a clear solution to, an open source functioning solution. And so of course the key problem that it's solving is the part that I've got highlighted there in yellow, and I'll read it out for those who can't quite see it on the screen. The root problem with conventional currency is all of the trust that's required to make it work. Now that's really, really important, because you'll find as we go on that one of the central things that a lot of these other cryptos seem to bring back in is the need for this sort of trust and decentralization. In other words, going against the very problem that this stuff originally was designed to solve. All right, now what I'm looking at here is, if we go back even further, this is what we call it Bitcoin prehistory, but it's a little hard to see all of these components that are here. But what these are is a collection of all of the various individual pieces of technology that came together to produce the phenomenon we now know as Bitcoin. Now, Bitcoin, as you can see, is the eventual thing. I should be pointing at the one you can actually see at the very end of that graph, at the very end of that line there, 2009. But the component parts that came together in a very game theoretically balanced way have been going back there since the 1970s. It wasn't just, as I said, a whole cloth invention right at 2009. And the thing that I want to point out in particular, if I could, I'll point to it on this screen here, is if you have a look down here, there's something there from 1991. It's S. Harbour and W.S. Stornetta, How to Timestamp a Digital Document. Now, that might not mean very much when you take it on the name of its paper right there, but what that actually was the invention of blockchain. Now, you might have heard that word before. Everyone's heard the word blockchain before. And it's often been said that, if we go on to the next slide, did I just skip one then? No, there we go. That it's often been said that blockchain is the sort of underlying technology to Bitcoin. And what happened during, I suppose it started to happen earlier, but it really took off big time in sort of 2017 and 2018, was we had a lot of the legacy financial institutions come out and say that, well, you know, it's not Bitcoin, that currency, that new currency that's important, but it's the technology that underlies Bitcoin that's important. And what they were referring to that was blockchain technology. So it proceeded upon this mistaken premise that you could just take out from that timeline I showed you earlier, that you could just take out blockchain technology and somehow make it useful on its own without all of the other things that went with it, including another very important part of Bitcoin called proof of work. Now, the question should be to everybody, is if the underlying technology the underlying technology of Bitcoin was so useful and so important, then why wasn't it used any time between 1991, when it was first developed, and 2008, when the first when Bitcoin was launched? And of course, the answer to that is it really wasn't. And we're seeing, and of course, when you know what a blockchain is, it's simply a data structure. It's very often has been put forward for many years now as essentially a marketing buzzword. But it is nothing more than a particular data structure that allows you to have a bunch of data. You take a kind of fingerprint of that data, and then you add that fingerprint as well as the new data onto the end of the file, as it were. So think of it more like a database that you can only add data to. Now, of course, those of you who have sort of looked a bit more deeply into what a blockchain is, it's easy enough to change that data because you can go back down the chain and recompute everything. But when it's combined with proof of work, you would have to redo all of the proof of work. With Bitcoin, it combines it with the hashing that you might have, the mining that we've talked about before. You're all familiar with the idea of Bitcoin mining. That mining normally would make the Bitcoin blockchain impossible to change because you'd have to redo all of the mining for the previous blocks, an impossible computational challenge. But if you just take blockchain on its own and take the mining out of it, then it would actually be trivially easy to recompute all of the blocks back down the chain. And so all you've created is you're just using a particular database structure for the sake of using it, yet you don't have the immutability and security that you have when it's combined with proof of work and the other technology that's part of Bitcoin. So as I say there, it's not immutable, it's not censorship resistant without the proof of work that Bitcoin has. Now, some of these things do have a degree of proof of work with them, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But the other problem with blockchain technology is it's often used to address problems, even though it's a solution looking for a problem to solve from the outset. But when it's looking to solve problems that involve physical things in the real world. Now, when you have Bitcoin, you have a private key. It's a piece of information that you have, and as long as only you have it, then only you can spend the money that's on the Bitcoin blockchain. So that means that the information, that private key, that is one, and the actual asset, being the Bitcoin money, are one and the same. But when you try to use a blockchain to use it as a ledger for recording things that are in the real world, such as people have tried to use it for supply chains, or they try to use it as an asset ledger for things in the real world, then because it's like the difference between a map and territory. Just because you have a map of something doesn't mean you also possess the territory that's covered by that map. They're two separate things. And so just because you have a ledger that denotes ownership of a particular piece of property, or it says that a certain package passed some point on a supply chain, you still are going to need a particular individual, a trusted individual in the physical realm to connect the thing that's on the ledger and enforce that in the real world. Because you've got the digital realm, which exists, which is what Bitcoin is. It purely exists within the digital realm. That's why it works. But then when you try to use it for real world things, you've got that jump. You've got to get out of the digital realm and interface it with the physical world. So that requires you to put a whole lot of trust back in there. So the question then becomes, well, if you're now having to trust the people to carry out the wishes of that ledger, you may as well have just trusted that same person to run it on a traditional database, or a distributed database for that matter. Just because it's a database doesn't mean you can't have redundancy and all of the other arguments that are put for using a blockchain. You can distribute your database, and that stuff has been around for decades. There's nothing new about it. One of the other things that's often used as a reason to have these cryptos and other blockchains is to address what people consider to be shortcomings in Bitcoin itself. And we'll get into that in the next slide. But the reason that that's a problem is because they don't tell you what the trade-offs are when they decide that they're going to bring up an alternative blockchain project to address the issues with Bitcoin. They don't tell you what the trade-offs are. And we'll have a look at what that means in just a second here. There's a little bit of a delay. Is it going to work? I don't want to hit it twice. There we go. So this here is called the blockchain trilemma. That's 10 minutes in or 10 minutes left. I think it was 10 minutes left, we agreed. Okay, the blockchain trilemma here is decentralization, scalability, security, pick two. Now, Bitcoin has picked the decentralization and security. And of course, one of the biggest criticisms of Bitcoin is the scalability, in that they say it can only do 7 transactions per second and this sort of thing, and that's not going to be sufficient for money in the real world. And so other blockchains have come along and they've said, oh, we're going to make it so that it can do 50,000 transactions a second. But in order to do that, they have had to take away far more important sacrosanct aspects of what Bitcoin invented, which was its decentralization. Because in order to be able to process that many transactions, you're not going to be able to have nodes evenly distributed all over the world. You end up with 1 or 2 nodes run in data centers. I better move on pretty quickly, as I won't dwell too much more on some of those points I wanted to make. So the other thing you often hear used is, and again it goes back to my first slide, is people often use the word use cases and good projects to describe this. Well, surely, I bring up that example of what that guy, the young guy at the beginning that got rug pulled. Surely they're not all like that. Surely there are some use cases and good projects. But the reality is that we've been hearing about potential use cases and good projects for almost a decade now. But in the real world, unfortunately, people really don't care. Even if they were true, unfortunately, really nobody cares about those things because, again, it ends up being that the so-called good projects narrative is all about giving plausible deniability to what these things really end up being. In other words, as I said before, a marketing buzzword to entice people looking for the next big thing or the next Bitcoin to invest in, or just straight up gambling. It's also true that there's a lot of people that have a dedicated self-interest into basically hyping these things for more than they really are. Like the listing fee from exchanges often get a listing fee for these sort of things. And of course, the influencers are paid to actually they won't often talk about a certain project or token unless they've received a certain allocation of those tokens, which what do they go and do? Most of the time, they're not any more interested in them than anyone else turns out to be, and they dump them on their followers. And of course, even the foundations behind some of the largest crypto projects like Ethereum or XRP have only ever sold the tokens. These are pre-mined. They're essentially database entries that are pre-mined. Even if they are on a blockchain, they're pre-mined, and very often they don't even go through the pretense of any of that, and they're simply a database entry which is sold to people and only ever sold to people. Seems to skip one ahead. So, a quick point here about, of course, one of the many narratives of crypto, they're changing all of the time, is, again, NFTs. NFTs was the most recent one. We went through, I think, ICOs and decentralized autonomous corporations. NFTs was last year's big thing. And here's a perfect example here. Here's a tweet here of exactly how that works. Why would anyone buy this stuff? Again, there's an infinite number of these things that can keep being made. And if you read the quote there, I just mined an NFT and bid on my own auction and sold it to myself for 100 grand. Then I relisted it and some sucker bid 30K and they were thrilled to get it for 70% off. That was that guy. And of course, the point to make there is that without fungibility, why would you want it to be non-fungible? The fungibility is the entire point. Without fungibility, there's no market mechanism to determine a fair rate of exchange greater than 0 for this immaterial thing that costs literally nothing for anybody to create. And again, this is sort of the current narrative, and in a way I think that what we're seeing here with the current narrative, in other words, meme coins, is a reversion to what these things fundamentally always were. It's actually, in a way, it's more ridiculous, but it's a little more honest at least, I'll say that much. In that all people really cared about was what they can get, trying to buy, as far down in that green area as they can and sell it as close as they can to the peak at the top. It's just straight up gambling. This here was the token that the young man at the beginning had bought into and got rugged on. This is Libra coin. This is actually the one put out by... Yes, James?
Can I add something here?
Yep.
My colleague at Glassnode just ran every token in their database, and he found that
It's exactly the same. Yep. It's a perfect case study. That's all it's all about, is just getting in below that peak and then dumping as close to the top of that peak you can before you get dumped on. And that same pattern is repeated. That one was launched by the president of a country, Argentina, wasn't it? The Trump coin even did the same thing. So if you can't even get, there's nothing there long term. It's not a long-term play. It's not to be taken seriously. Now, of course, the other argument used against these things is, let's say we create something that has all of the attributes of Bitcoin. It's a complete copy of it, but then again, but yet somehow proposes to make, well, I'm going to make it so instead of waiting 10 minutes for a transaction to clear on the blockchain, mine's going to be 5 minutes. Now, this is going to play as a video, but has everyone ever seen the movie There's Something About Mary? About 20-year-old movie, and there's a scene in the car where he picks up a hitchhiker. And the hitchhiker tries to pitch him on something. He goes, have you heard of that thing called 8-minute abs? You heard of 8-minute abs? You get the exercise routine, you get the abs in 8 minutes. Well, here's a proposal for you: 7-minute abs. So every single alternative proposal that Bitcoin is really just 7-minute abs. Okay, well, what happens if someone comes along with 6-minute abs? Where are you going to be? I mean, the idea here is that you can't invent this thing more than once, because again, as soon as if there was to be something whereby you could supersede Bitcoin in that way, it's just as easily superseded by something else again. So there's only really one bet here you can take. You could either bet on nothing and give this whole thing a miss, or if you are going to bet, then the only one that can succeed is Bitcoin and Bitcoin alone. Otherwise, you've just got the 7-minute abs problem. And of course, I go through that here. So why there's no next Bitcoin? Of course, Bitcoin has that immaculate conception. There was no pre-mine. There was no one knew whether this would work or not, so it's not copying someone else's idea. It's also what's called a shelling point. How long have I got? Am I over? No? Good. 5 minutes. Terrific. I can do it. Okay. Bitcoin is also what's called a shelling point. Has anyone heard of that expression before, a shelling point? Yep, a few people. Okay. The idea is that in the absence of any information communicated between people, it's a position that people converge upon. So if I was going to say to Hugh, look, I'm going to meet you somewhere in New York City, but we're not going to tell each other when and where. We might tell what day we're going to meet there, but we're not going to tell each other when and where. The idea of that is we're not likely to be meeting on a random street corner at a random time. We would converge upon something that has some meaning to it, something sensible. Like, for example, we would meet at Grand Central Station at 12 p.m. It's not going to be, the corner of whatever street at 3:05 or something like that. That's called a shelling point. We see many shelling points in the world that people naturally converge on. Bitcoin is the only thing that has that shelling point, one of which is its immaculate conception and the fact that it's the first blockchain and the only one that has all of the attributes that I mentioned before as to what makes it the ideal form of money. And of course, the digital scarcity. Ultimately, what we are dealing with here is the invention of digital scarcity. So again, if you're going to have digital scarcity, it has to be resistant to replicability itself. You can't just accept that there's going to be 100 other tokens that also have the same properties, because then you don't have digital scarcity anymore. And as I mentioned before, if it were flipped or superseded, so too would anything that replaced it, invalidating all future possible attempts at digital scarcity. And of course, who wouldn't want digital scarcity in the world after we've got it? So to conclude, I think that for all of you here, we owe it in terms of getting this stuff adopted to be the steady hands and the calm voice, because more and more people are going to seek to learn about Bitcoin. So we want to help keep them Bitcoin focused and avoid the scams and provide them with quality references. And I've got a number of different books there that are highly recommended by the Bitcoin community to find out what this is really all about. It's very, very easy to get distracted. These books will show you what's important. Help you, of course, as well. You need to help them understand privacy and security. Again, that's holding your own Bitcoin and holding it privately, because again, that's another great attribute that can be used in Bitcoin. And of course, I mentioned holding your own keys. And ideally, send them to Bitcoin-only exchanges such as our sponsor here today, Hardblock, is a Bitcoin-only exchange. That's a bigger challenge. It's a big challenge for a business to do, to be Bitcoin-only. It takes a lot of integrity because there's a lot of money to be made essentially flipping people in and out of a whole bunch of useless shit coins that will get them nowhere. There's nothing long-term there, and it'll get a lot of people wrecked. And so, we're lucky in this country that we're well served by a number of Bitcoin-only exchanges. So with that, I think we're done. There we are. Thank you.